The first thing Ethan Walker took back wasn't a house, it wasn't a fence, it wasn't even the road. It was the massive stone monument at the entrance of Cedar Creek Preserve, a towering slab of polished granite engraved with the community's name in gold letters, flanked by manicured hedges and solar-powered landscape lighting that burned through the night on land his family had owned for generations. By sunset on that final Tuesday, county deputies were dismantling it piece by piece, while hundreds of homeowners stood along the sidewalk in stunned, breathless silence, some clutching their phones, some holding their children's hands, all of them watching a version of reality they had trusted for 20 years collapse in real time. The HOA president was screaming at anyone who would listen. The sheriff was holding a court order, and for the first time in 2 decades, the truth was finally, irreversibly impossible to hide, because the land beneath their community, the road they drove on every morning, the entrance their guests passed through, the utilities that powered their homes, none of it had ever belonged to the Homeowners Association. It had always belonged to the Walker family. And somebody had spent 20 years making absolutely certain that nobody discovered it. Ethan Walker had spent 30 years doing work that most people never thought about until something broke. Infrastructure was invisible until it failed. And failure, real failure, the kind that flooded basements or buckled roads or left a city block without clean water, was the only moment the public remembered that someone had to design and inspect and maintain all of it. He was an infrastructure engineer, the kind of man who understood that civilization didn't run on laws or goodwill. It ran on water pressure, load-bearing specifications, drainage grades, and property surveys done right the first time. He had worked on bridge rehabilitations in Ohio, water main expansions in Nevada, pipeline corridor assessments in Montana, and flood mitigation systems in Louisiana. His career had taken him across the country and back again so many times that his wife, Sandra, used to joke that home was wherever his truck happened to be parked. He had loved the work, truly loved it. But 30 years was 30 years, and when the retirement letter finally left his desk, he signed it without hesitation. He was 61 years old, his knees had opinions about stairs, and he was done. The call about his grandfather came 3 weeks later. Samuel Walker had passed away at the age of 89 in the same farmhouse he had been born in, on the same land his own father had broken before him, in a county outside of Austin, Texas that most GPS systems still struggled to locate correctly. Samuel had never moved. He had never wanted to. He had worked 1,100 acres of ranch land his entire adult life, raised cattle, leased grazing rights to neighbors, repaired his own fences, and paid his property taxes every year without exception. He was not a wealthy man by any modern definition, but he was a man who owned something solid and real, and he had never once forgotten what that meant. Ethan flew down for the funeral, stood at the graveside with a handful of cousins he barely recognized, and listened to the county pastor read from Psalms as a dry Texas wind moved through the live oaks. The lawyers' meeting came 2 days later, in a small office that smelled like old paper and motor oil, and in the space of 45 minutes, Ethan Walker became the sole heir to Walker Ranch, 1,100 acres of Texas land, legally described and deed recorded, stretching from the old creek bed in the east to the ridge line in the northwest. There were no other significant heirs contesting the will. Samuel had been precise about that too, updating his documentation regularly, the way meticulous people do when they understand that clarity now prevents conflict later. He remembered being 8 years old, riding in his grandfather's truck across those same acres, the windows down and the radio playing something old and staticky, the Texas heat making the air above the grass shimmer and bend. Samuel had a way of talking about land that wasn't romantic exactly. It was more serious than that, more like the way a doctor talks about the body, with a combination of respect and practicality rooted in long experience. This ground has been here longer than our name has, his grandfather had told him once. It doesn't need us to survive, but we need it, and that means we have to be worth the responsibility. Ethan had not fully understood that at 8. He understood it completely now. He and Sandra sold their house in Colorado, rented a moving truck, and drove south. He was going to spend whatever years he had left taking care of the land his grandfather had given him. He had plans, modest ones, careful ones, a small cattle operation, some habitat restoration along the creek corridor, maybe a wildflower meadow on the south-facing slope. He had the professional background to manage the land intelligently. He had the time. He was, for the first time in his adult life, exactly where he wanted to be. On the 23rd day after they moved in, a white SUV pulled through the ranch gate and parked in front of the farmhouse. Ethan watched it from the porch, coffee in hand, curious in the way a man is curious when something unexpected appears on land he is still learning to know. The man who stepped out of the white SUV was wearing a polo shirt with an embroidered logo on the chest, a small green tree, over the words Cedar Creek Preserve Homeowners Association. He was perhaps 40, carrying a leather folder, and he walked toward the porch with the practiced confidence of someone who had delivered unwelcome paperwork before. He introduced himself as a community liaison and explained, pleasantly but firmly, that he was there to welcome Ethan to the neighborhood and to provide him with his welcome packet, which included his HOA membership documentation, community guidelines, and fee schedule for the current fiscal year. Ethan looked at the man for a moment, then looked at the embroidered logo, then looked out at the scrub brush and the rusted cattle gate and the dry Texas sky, and said, as politely as he could manage, that he believed there had been some kind of mistake. The liaison insisted there had not. He pointed generally eastward and explained that Cedar Creek Preserve, a planned residential community of 214 homes, bordered Ethan's property, or rather, as the man carefully phrased it, that Ethan's property fell within the association's designated service boundary. Ethan took the welcome packet. He shook the man's hand. He waited until the white SUV had disappeared down the ranch road before he opened it. Inside was a map. The map showed Cedar Creek Preserve's community footprint, and on that map, a substantial portion of what Ethan understood to be Walker Ranch was shaded in the association's green color, labeled as Common Area and Infrastructure Corridor. He set the packet on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. The next morning, Victoria Langston arrived. She drove a newer white SUV. Apparently the association had a fleet, and she stepped out wearing linen slacks and heeled boots, and the expression of a woman who expected to be taken seriously because she always had been. She was the president of the Cedar Creek Preserve HOA board, had been for 7 years, and she carried herself with the particular authority of someone who had never had that authority seriously questioned. She spread a laminated map across the hood of her vehicle and walked Ethan through it with a finger and a calm, instructive tone, explaining that his current construction activity, specifically the fence line he had begun repairing along the eastern boundary, was taking place on land that fell under HOA jurisdiction, and that he would need to halt immediately, submit an architectural review application, and bring himself into compliance with community standards before any further work could proceed. The map she was showing him looked official. It had a county seal in the corner. It had survey notations along the margins. It had colored boundary lines that appeared precise and authoritative. It was, in every visual respect, the kind of document that reasonable people accept without question, because reasonable people encounter official-looking documents and assume that the process which produced them was legitimate. But Ethan Walker was an infrastructure engineer. He had spent 30 years reading surveys, interpreting boundary documentation, and understanding the difference between a document that reflected reality and one that had been produced to create a version of reality. Something about what he was looking at did not sit right, not in any specific, articulable way, not yet, but in the deep professional instinct of a man who had spent decades working with accurate measurements and knew, in his bones, when something had been measured wrong. He thanked Victoria for her time. He did not stop the fence repair. And that night, sitting at his grandfather's old kitchen table with the welcome packet and Victoria's laminated map spread out in front of him, he thought, if she is right, my family has lost something enormous and no one ever told us. He poured another cup of coffee and started making calls. Ethan began with the family's own files, a set of banker's boxes in the farmhouse attic that his grandfather had kept with the meticulous consistency of a man who trusted paper more than people. The original deed to Walker Ranch was there, recorded in 1951, describing the property in precise meets and bounds language that referenced specific survey monuments, creek beds, and ridge lines. There were supplemental surveys from 1968 and 1984, both confirming the same boundaries. There were tax receipts going back decades, all listing the same acreage, 1,103 acres, assessed and paid. Ethan photographed everything and drove to the county courthouse the following morning. The county land records office was staffed by 2 clerks and smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and the particular stillness of a room where time moves differently because the documents on the shelves do not age the way the people reading them do. Ethan spent 4 hours there, pulling records, cross-referencing parcel numbers, and working through the chain of title on the eastern portion of the property, the section that Cedar Creek Preserve appeared to claim as its own. He was methodical about it, the way he had been methodical about every investigation in his career, Start with the original document. Trace every conveyance forward. Note every discrepancy and every gap. What he found was not a clean answer. It was a discrepancy. The boundary lines on the HOA's recorded plat did not match the boundary lines on the Walker Ranch deed. They were close enough that a non-expert might not notice, close enough that a casual glance at either document in isolation would not raise a flag, but they were not the same. The eastern line of Walker Ranch, as described in the original deed, extended several hundred feet further than the western line of Cedar Creek Preserve's recorded plat acknowledged. Someone, at some point in the 20-year history of that community, had drawn a line in the wrong place and filed it as though it were correct. He called Rebecca Hayes that evening. Rebecca was a real property attorney based in Austin whom a former colleague had recommended sharp, experienced, and specifically knowledgeable about Texas land law, which had its own dense and occasionally contentious history rooted in Spanish land grants, Republic-era surveys, and a long tradition of boundary disputes that had sometimes ended badly for everyone involved. He explained what he had found, walking her through the documents in order. She listened without interrupting, asked 2 or 3 precise questions at the end, and then said she wanted to see everything he had. She reviewed the materials over the following week and called him back with a measured but unambiguous assessment. The HOA's plat documentation showed characteristics consistent with alteration. The survey reference monuments cited in Cedar Creek Preserve's recorded documents did not correspond to the actual physical monuments that existed in the field. Someone had, at some point, produced paperwork that described boundaries which did not reflect the land as it actually existed. While Rebecca was building her analysis, the HOA did not wait quietly. A formal notice arrived by certified mail, informing Ethan that his fence repair constituted an unauthorized structure on association land, and that he was subject to a fine of $250 per day until the structure was removed. 3 days later, a second notice arrived, a billing statement for retroactive HOA dues calculated from the date of his recorded deed transfer, totaling $11,000 and change, with a note that additional fees would accrue monthly. Ethan filed both notices in a manila folder labeled simply evidence. He was not angry. He was, if anything, more focused. He had spent a career solving problems that started with bad information, and the method was always the same. Find out what was actually true before deciding what to do about it. The phone rang on a Thursday afternoon, an unknown number with a local area code. The man on the other end identified himself only as a retired county employee, gave no last name, and spoke in the careful, spare way of someone who had waited a long time to say something he had thought through many times. He said he had heard through county hall circles that someone was finally asking questions about Cedar Creek Preserve's boundaries. He said he hoped Ethan would pursue it. And then he said something that reoriented everything. Forget the houses. Look at the road. Ethan hired a licensed independent surveyor, a firm from San Antonio with no prior relationship to Cedar Creek Preserve, its developer, or any affiliated entity. He wanted results that no one could credibly challenge. Clean work from someone with no stake in what the measurements revealed. The survey team spent 4 days in the field, running GPS equipment and locating physical monuments, pulling historical aerial photographs from the county assessor's archive, and systematically mapping the relationship between the Walker Ranch deed description and every significant structure and improvement within 1,000 feet of the eastern boundary. The report arrived on a Tuesday. Ethan sat at the kitchen table and read it twice. Then he called Rebecca and read it to her over the phone, slowly, section by section. Neither of them spoke for a moment when he finished the last page. The main gate of Cedar Creek Preserve, the decorative iron structure with the community name welded in script across the top, the one that featured prominently in the community's own promotional materials, sat entirely on Walker Ranch property. The stone monument at the entrance, the one with the gold letters and the solar landscape lighting that burned through the night, sat on Walker Ranch property. The access road connecting Cedar Creek Preserve to the county highway, the only vehicular route into or out of the community, the road that 214 families drove every single day for work and school and groceries and emergencies, ran entirely across Walker Ranch property for its full length of approximately 1,200 feet. Before reaching the county right-of-way, the buried utility corridors serving the community water, sewer, and electrical passed through Walker Ranch land without any recorded easement in Ethan's chain of title. There was no legal instrument, anywhere in the recorded county documents, granting Cedar Creek Preserve the right to use any of it, not a temporary license, not an unrecorded agreement, nothing. Ethan sat with that for a moment. He was not a litigious man by nature. He had always preferred solving problems over winning arguments. But as he read the survey report again, the picture it painted became impossible to avoid. Cedar Creek Preserve had been built, operated, and maintained for 20 years on land that was not theirs to use. Every homeowner who drove through that gate every morning was doing so across property that belonged, in full legal title, to the Walker family. And Victoria Langston, when she had come to his door with her laminated map and her linen slacks and her architectural review application, had not been trying to protect her community's rights. She had been trying to protect access. She had been trying to make sure Ethan did not figure out that without his land, her community had no way in or out. He asked Rebecca to send a formal inquiry to the HOA board, requesting documentation of any recorded easement, right-of-way agreement, or land use license pertaining to the entrance road and utility corridors. Rebecca sent it via certified mail and email simultaneously, addressed to the board as a whole. Then Ethan drove out to the eastern fence line, finished the repair he had started, and went back to work on his ranch. He did not hear back from Victoria, but 2 days later, he noticed nails scattered across the ranch road near the gate. The intimidation started small, the way it usually does when people are frightened. Roofing nails distributed across the gravel road, his work truck with a flat tire one morning, then two, a pile of construction debris, broken drywall, bent rebar, fast food wrappers dumped against the fence line on 3 separate occasions. A no trespassing sign Ethan had posted at the boundary line was pulled from the ground and thrown into the adjacent drainage ditch. He documented each incident with photographs, timestamps, and written descriptions in a log he kept on his phone. He did not call the sheriff yet. He was patient in the way that people are patient when they know they are building something that will eventually be unassailable. Within the Cedar Creek Preserve community, Victoria was running a different kind of operation, one that Ethan could observe only in fragments, through second-hand accounts and forwarded screenshots, but whose shape became clear quickly. It was the shape of a managed story, and Victoria was its only authorized narrator. The neighborhood's private online forum, a members-only platform she moderated personally, became the venue for a coordinated narrative in which Ethan Walker was cast as a predatory outsider attempting to steal land from hardworking families who had purchased their homes in good faith and paid their mortgages for years. He was described as a fraudster, a squatter in reverse, a man trying to weaponize a technical legal dispute to extract money from innocent homeowners. Some posts were more measured, many were not. Photographs of Ethan's truck, his fence work, and his property gate appeared alongside captions that ranged from mocking to threatening. He was aware of all of it. Several homeowners who did not support what was happening had begun forwarding him screenshots. He read each one carefully. He added them to the evidence folder. He was not angry exactly. The anger would have been understandable, but what he mostly felt was something closer to professional recognition, the specific clarity of a man who had spent his career identifying where systems had been built wrong and understanding precisely why. Victoria Langston was not acting from confidence. She was acting from fear. That distinction mattered because it meant she would escalate. He ordered a full wireless camera system and spent a weekend afternoon installing it himself, 14 units, covering the fence lines, the gate, the ranch road, the equipment shed, and the eastern boundary from 2 angles. He ran the feeds to a cloud-based recording system with redundant backup. He did not advertise that he had done this. On a Wednesday evening, 11 days after the first nail incident, the camera covering the eastern fence line captured 2 men in Cedar Creek Preserve security uniforms cutting the fence wire with bolt cutters. On a Saturday morning, a camera at the gate recorded a truck backing up to Ethan's equipment shed, the driver and a passenger attempting to access the padlocked door for approximately 6 minutes before giving up. 3 days later, the same 2 men from the fence incident appeared on camera walking the boundary line at 2 in the morning, apparently measuring or marking something. Ethan had it all, but the footage was not what escalated things past the point of patience. What changed everything happened on a Tuesday afternoon when Sandra called him from town. A man had been following her since the grocery store. He stayed close enough to make clear he was there. She had driven 2 extra routes to confirm it before calling. That same evening, their son Marcus, visiting for a long weekend with his girlfriend, came inside from the driveway looking unsettled and said that a man in a car he did not recognize had approached him near the mailbox while he walked back from checking on the horses. The man had been friendly, casual, asking about the property, about the family's plans, how long they intended to stay. Marcus had answered vaguely and come inside immediately. He was 28 years old and not easily rattled. He was rattled. That night, after Sandra was asleep, Marcus sat across from his father at the kitchen table. He asked, quietly and directly, whether they were going to lose the ranch. Ethan looked at his son for a moment, this adult man who had grown up watching his father solve complicated problems methodically and without drama, and said, calmly, no, they were not going to lose anything. Marcus nodded. He trusted that. Ethan let him go to bed, and then sat alone in the kitchen for another hour, the camera feeds open on his laptop, the evidence folder on the table beside him. In the morning, he called Rebecca Hayes. He did not raise his voice. He said 4 words, no more waiting, file. Rebecca was not a dramatic person, but she was extremely effective, and when she decided to move, she moved comprehensively. She filed suit on behalf of Ethan Walker against the Cedar Creek Preserve HOA, its board of directors, and several named individual officers, asserting claims of trespass, wrongful use of land, interference with property rights, and civil harassment. The filing was not a warning shot. It was the whole case, structured and evidenced, delivered in one motion with the quiet confidence of someone who has been waiting for the right moment and recognizes it clearly. Simultaneously, she issued a battery of discovery request subpoenas for all board meeting minutes from the preceding 10 years, all correspondence between board officers relating to the property boundary, all financial records related to the maintenance and use of the entrance road, all contracts with any survey firm or engineering contractor in the preceding decade, and all communications with the original developer of Cedar Creek Preserve or any entity affiliated with that developer. Inside the association's administrative offices, the effect was immediate and visible. Board members who had trusted Victoria's assurances for years suddenly had lawyers on the phone asking questions they could not answer comfortably. Questions about what they knew, when they knew it, and what actions they had taken or not taken as a result. Emergency meetings were called and then canceled. The community manager, a contracted employee who had always suspected certain aspects of the association's operations were irregular, quietly began consulting his own attorney about his personal liability exposure. Olivia Grant had been the HOA's board secretary for 4 years. She was a retired middle school principal, precise and organized, the kind of person who kept thorough records because she believed thorough records were the foundation of institutional integrity, and who had, in her teaching career, developed a reliable instinct for recognizing when an authority figure in a room was managing a narrative rather than telling the truth. She had joined the board because she genuinely cared about the community, the parks, the sidewalks, the summer movie nights on the common lawn. She had trusted that the board's legal standing was what Victoria had always said it was: solid, documented, and handled. As the discovery subpoenas arrived, and Victoria began instructing board members on what to retain and what to dispose of, Olivia began to understand that she had been wrong. She attended a closed-door board meeting in Victoria's home office, where Victoria laid out, in the controlled language of someone trying to manage a room, a strategy for responding to the litigation that involved selective record retention, strategic non-production of certain documents, and the delegation of responsibility for past decisions to parties who were no longer reachable. Olivia sat in that room and listened and understood, with the precision of someone who had spent 30 years in public education navigating institutional accountability, that what Victoria was describing was not a legal defense strategy, it was a cover-up. And more specifically, it was the kind of cover-up that required someone to be a scapegoat. She was the secretary. She was the one who signed the minutes. She left the meeting early, saying she was not feeling well. That was true, in its way. 3 days later, she called Rebecca Hayes' office and asked for an appointment. The USB drive Olivia Grant handed to Rebecca Hayes in a conference room in Austin contained 5 years of internal HOA communications, archived board meeting minutes, a series of internal financial reports, and most significantly, a collection of emails exchanged between Victoria Langston and the HOA's legal counsel dating back approximately 5 years from the present. Rebecca reviewed the contents that evening and called Ethan the following morning. Her voice, normally measured to the point of flatness, had a quality in it that he had not heard before, not excitement exactly, but the focused intensity of someone who has found exactly what they were looking for and understands what it means. She said, "The emails don't just support our case, they change the nature of it." The emails told a story that had been carefully kept away from the association's homeowners. 5 years prior, The HOA had commissioned its own routine boundary survey as part of a planned infrastructure upgrade. The survey firm had completed its work and delivered its findings, and those findings had been alarming. The entrance road, the gate structure, and the utility corridors all appeared to fall outside the HOA's legally recorded property and outside the scope of any recorded easement. The survey firm had recommended, in writing, that the association immediately engage legal counsel to address the title question before proceeding with any further improvements. They had specifically noted that if the underlying deed records were accurate, the association's use of the road and associated infrastructure could constitute trespass on private property. Victoria had received that report. She had read it. There were email responses indicating she understood its content clearly, including one message to her private attorney in which she used the phrase significant exposure and asked about statutes of limitation. And then she had made a decision. She had not disclosed the findings to the board. She had not disclosed them to the homeowners. She had hired a different attorney, one whose correspondence focused not on resolving the boundary question but on managing the exposure and ensuring that the association's use of the land continued undisrupted. The survey firm's report had been filed internally, under a project reference number that did not appear in any board minutes or public-facing documentation and had never been referenced again in any official communication. The HOA had continued operating as though the question had never been raised, had continued collecting dues, had continued maintaining and improving the entrance road, had even resurfaced it in the spring of the year following the suppressed survey, using homeowner funds to improve infrastructure built on land they had no right to, and had continued presenting its property claims to the world as settled and uncontested. Victoria had not built the fraud. She had inherited a situation that someone else had created and had chosen, deliberately and knowingly, to perpetuate it rather than address it. That was the distinction Ethan had sensed from the beginning. She was not the architect. She was the custodian. But custodianship of a lie, held for 5 knowing years, was not a defense. Rebecca told Ethan all of this in the precise, methodical way she told him everything. There was a pause at the end. He asked a single question. Then who started it? Rebecca said she was already looking. The answer to that question required a different kind of investigation, one that went back not 5 years but 20, to the original development of Cedar Creek Preserve. Rebecca engaged a title research specialist and a forensic document examiner, and over 6 weeks of archive work across 3 counties, the picture came together with the grim clarity of something that had been obvious in hindsight from the beginning. The developer who had built Cedar Creek Preserve 2 decades earlier had needed road access to the property he intended to develop. The most direct and cost-effective route ran across the corner of Walker Ranch. The legally correct way to obtain that access was to negotiate a recorded easement with the landowner Samuel Walker, which would have required his consent and almost certainly a payment. Negotiating with Samuel Walker was not something the developer had apparently been willing to invest in. By the account of a former business associate whose deposition Rebecca had obtained through the discovery process, the developer had described Samuel as the kind of man who reads every line twice and says no to half of them. The developer had been on a tight financing timeline and a tight margin. He had made a choice. The alternative approach, as the forensic examiner's report detailed, involved the preparation of a set of documents, a site plan, a recorded plat, and an access easement filing that described the entrance road corridor as falling within the boundaries of the development parcel rather than on Walker Ranch land. The documents bore notarizations and recording stamps that appeared official. The boundary descriptions were drawn in a way that was technically ambiguous enough to survive casual review, but that reflected, as the surveyor's report made clear, an adjusted depiction of where the property lines actually ran. The easement that should have been negotiated and recorded with Samuel Walker's signature had simply never existed. Instead, documentation had been filed that made the question appear already resolved in the developer's favor by the time anyone looked at it. Samuel had never been informed of any of it. He had lived and worked on his land for the remainder of his life without knowing that a portion of his eastern boundary had been quietly redrawn on paper by a man who preferred forgery to negotiation. He had never had cause to commission a boundary survey. After the development was built, his operations were on the western and central sections of the ranch, away from the road corridor, where the cattle grazed and the creek ran and the life of the ranch went on as it always had. His taxes never changed. His deed was never challenged. His neighbors never raised a question. And so the fiction had simply sat there, year after year, load-bearing in the way that undiscovered falsehoods are load-bearing, holding up a structure that 214 families had built their lives on top of, unaware that the foundation beneath them had been prepared by someone who had decided that the law was optional when it was inconvenient. Rebecca compiled the complete case in a brief that was, by the time she finished, 63 pages long, supported by survey reports, forensic document analysis, the archived emails from Olivia's USB, the original Walker Ranch deed documentation, the county records, and the independent survey Ethan had commissioned at the start. She filed it in the district court and requested an expedited hearing date. The request was granted. 2 months later, Ethan Walker drove to the courthouse in a truck his grandfather would have recognized. The courtroom was not large, but it was full. Representatives from the HOA board sat on one side with their legal team. Rebecca Hayes sat beside Ethan at the plaintiff's table with her 63-page brief, and a composure that Ethan had come to understand was not performance. It was the natural state of a person who had done the work and knew it. Olivia Grant sat in the gallery as a cooperative witness, her hands folded in her lap, her expression carrying the particular weight of someone who has done a difficult thing and is not entirely certain history will recognize it as courage. Victoria Langston sat at the defense table in a dark blazer, her expression carefully controlled in the way that people's expressions are when they have run out of options but have not yet run out of pride. Rebecca presented the case in order, without theatrics and without visible emotion. She was the kind of attorney who understood that a well-organized set of true facts required no embellishment. She began with the Walker Ranch deed, recorded in 1951, and walked the court through the chain of title to the present. She presented the independent survey, showing the precise location of the entrance road, gate structures, and utility corridors relative to the deeded boundary. She presented the original developer's filing documents and the forensic examiner's analysis, showing that the boundary depiction in those documents did not correspond to the monuments and measurements that existed in the field. She presented the internal HOA survey from 5 years prior, the one Victoria had received and suppressed, along with the email correspondence, demonstrating that Victoria had understood its implications and chosen not to disclose them. She presented the camera footage from the intimidation campaign, the men with bolt cutters, the nighttime boundary walks, the truck at the equipment shed. She presented the surveillance of Sandra in town and Marcus at the mailbox as evidence of organized harassment. The HOA's legal team offered what it could. They argued good faith reliance on recorded documents. They argued that 20 years of uncontested use had created legitimate interests. They argued that the equities of the situation, 214 homeowners, 214 families, weighed against a strict application of the title record. The judge listened to all of it without visible reaction. Then she read her findings from the bench, slowly and without ambiguity. The Walker Ranch boundary was as described in the original deed. The entrance road, gate structures, and utility corridors fell entirely within the Walker property as legally defined. The HOA's recorded plat reflected a boundary depiction that was inconsistent with the physical and documentary evidence and had not been established by any valid legal instrument binding on the Walker chain of title. The association had no recorded easement, no right-of-way agreement, and no land use license of any kind authorizing its use of the relevant land. The claims in the HOA's notices, fine assessments, and membership demands against Ethan Walker were without legal basis and were hereby ordered vacated. The court found in favor of the plaintiff on all counts. The sheriff's department arrived at Cedar Creek Preserve the following morning with a copy of the court order, a court-appointed administrator, and a locksmith. The clubhouse was the first stop. The locks were changed, the keys handed to the administrator, who stood in the parking lot with a clipboard and a careful expression. The HOA's administrative offices in the same building were similarly secured. Filing cabinets that had not yet been subpoenaed were sealed pending further legal proceedings. The parking areas attached to the common facilities, which also sat on Walker land, were cordoned with yellow tape, and then the deputies moved to the entrance, where the work was more visible. A crew had been arranged. The stone monument, the polished granite slab with the gold lettering and the solar landscape lights, was disconnected from its electrical supply, rigged with strapping, and taken down in sections that were loaded onto a flatbed truck with the deliberate efficiency of men doing a job rather than making a point. It took less than 40 minutes. Homeowners gathered along the road in ones and twos, and then in larger groups, drawn by word spreading through the neighborhood the way news spreads in communities where everyone knows everyone quickly and with accumulating detail that was not always accurate. Some of them had lived here for 15 years, Some had raised their children here. Some had paid off their mortgages here and built gardens and painted rooms and known their neighbors by name for a decade. They had not created the fraud. They had only lived inside it, in good faith, unaware. The grief on the sidewalk was real. Ethan understood that, and it did not leave him unmoved. Victoria Langston stood at the edge of the crowd in her dark blazer, watching. She said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The court had referred the underlying fraud documentation to the county district attorney's office and to the state attorney general's real property division. Those processes would take their own time. She would have lawyers for years. That was the shape of the consequence she had chosen when she chose to protect the lie rather than correct it. Ethan had not come to the demolition to watch Victoria. He had come because the land was his, and he wanted to be there when it was returned to itself. He stood near the gate in a work jacket, hands in his pockets, watching the granite panels come down with the specific quiet attention of a man who has finished something long and difficult and is taking a moment to acknowledge it before moving on. Within 3 weeks of the court ruling, every homeowner in Cedar Creek Preserve received a letter on Walker Ranch letterhead, signed by Ethan Walker and reviewed by Rebecca Hayes. It was not a threatening letter. It was not a demand letter. It did not reference the harassment, the nails in the road, the surveillance of his wife, or the approach made to his son. It explained plainly and without editorializing that the court had confirmed the property rights that had always existed, that the HOA, as previously constituted, was no longer a functioning legal entity with authority over shared infrastructure, and that Ethan Walker was prepared to offer each household in the community a recorded land use agreement covering the entrance road access and all utility corridor rights. The term of the agreement was 30 years, automatically renewable. The annual fee was $1, payable in any form, due on January 1st. The agreement included a provision that no homeowners association would be formed or reformed with any authority over land Ethan owned without his written consent. Rebecca had suggested that last clause. Ethan had agreed immediately. There had been some people, in the weeks after the ruling, who had expected something different from him. They had expected the man who had been fined, harassed, surveilled, and publicly defamed to come in hard to demand compensation from the homeowners, to place conditions on road access, to let the community feel the weight of what had been done in its name. Some of them probably expected it because, in their position, they might have felt entitled to it. Ethan understood that. He was not a saint, and he had not been unmoved by the months of harassment and by what had been done to Sandra and Marcus. But he had always understood who the actual wrongdoers were and who the bystanders were, and he was not interested in punishing people for the sins of a developer who had died 4 years earlier and a board president who would face her own reckoning in other venues. What he wanted was simple and had always been simple. He wanted what his grandfather had built to continue to exist, to be properly documented, to be cared for. He wanted the record to reflect the truth. He wanted people to know that the land beneath Cedar Creek Preserve had never been given away, that it had always been held, and that his family had simply not known it was being used until he had come home to retire and started paying attention. The sign that went up at the entrance was simple, black lettering on a white post, "Private land, no HOA, no exceptions." It was not grandiose. It did not mention the Walker name or the court ruling or any of the events that had led to its placement. It simply stated the fact, the way facts ought to be stated, without performance and without apology. Below the sign, the entrance road was freshly graded, a small improvement Ethan had funded himself as a gesture toward the homeowners who drove it every day. On these evening after the sign went up, Ethan sat on the farmhouse porch and watched the sun go down over the western ridge, the same ridge his grandfather had watched from the same porch for most of his life. Sandra brought out 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him, and they were quiet for a while in the comfortable way of people who have been through something difficult together and come out intact. The live oaks along the creek were moving in a low evening breeze. The cattle in the south pasture were still. The sky was going through its colors the way Texas skies do extravagantly, without any particular concern for who might be watching. Ethan thought about his grandfather. He thought about the way Samuel had talked about the land, not as a possession exactly, not as a status symbol, not as something to be leveraged or developed or maximized, but as a responsibility held in trust, passed from one set of hands to the next, across generations. He could hear his grandfather's voice with unusual clarity that evening, the way you sometimes hear a dead person's voice when you have done something that would have made them quiet and approving. Land isn't something you own forever, Samuel had told him when he was 8 years old. riding across these same acres in a truck with the windows down. It's something you protect until it's someone else's turn. He had not fully understood that at 8. He understood it now in a way that went beyond the intellectual, in the way you understand something that has been tested. The protection his grandfather had in mind was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was showing up, being present, paying the taxes, maintaining the fences, and knowing exactly what the deed said and what it meant. Sometimes it meant 30 years away, doing work that would eventually give you the skills to come home and recognize when something was wrong. Sometimes protection looked like patience, the patience to document, to investigate, to build a case that couldn't be argued with, rather than acting from anger in the first moment it was available. And sometimes, at the end of it all, it meant offering $1 a year agreement to 214 families who had lived inside someone else's fraud and deserved to stay in their homes, because the goal had never been maximum damage. The goal had always been the truth. A truck passed on the county road at the edge of the property, its headlights sweeping briefly across the fence line before disappearing toward town. Somewhere in Cedar Creek Preserve, people were coming home from work, making dinner, helping with homework, living the ordinary life that they had moved here to have and had had, mostly in good faith. They had not chosen to be the beneficiaries of fraud. Most of them had never known. Ethan did not begrudge them that. What he begrudged quietly, without drama, was the years in which someone had decided that the truth was inconvenient and had buried it rather than deal with it, and had kept on burying it year after year, collecting dues and maintaining entrances and sending threatening notices until the weight of it had become so enormous that it had taken a retired engineer coming home to his grandfather's land to finally lift it. He had been, in the end, the right person to come home. Not because he was aggressive or litigious or even particularly brave, but because he was the kind of man who read the documentation, hired the surveyor, ran the camera wires, kept the log, and waited until the evidence was complete before he moved. His grandfather would have approved of the method. His grandfather, if Ethan was honest with himself, would have found the whole thing mildly satisfying in the dry, understated way of men who have watched bad actors eventually run out of road. The sky finished its performance. The stars came out over Texas in their usual density, more than you ever remembered until you were standing under them again. Sandra finished her coffee. Ethan finished his. He thought about Marcus, who had driven back to Dallas 2 weeks ago with his girlfriend and had called twice since to check in, less asking about the case now and more asking about the cattle, about the fence project, about whether the creek was running after the last rains. The land was starting to mean something to the next generation, not as an inheritance to be managed at a distance, but as a place to be present in. That felt like the most important thing that had come from all of this. Not the court ruling, not the demolished monument, not the $1-a-year agreements. Those were consequences, and consequences were necessary and just, but they were not the point. The point was something quieter and more durable. The ranch still existed. The deed still said what it had always said. The creek still ran in its season. The live oak still moved in the evening wind, and for the first time in 20 years, the record and the reality matched perfectly, without gap or deception or paper built to cover a lie. His grandfather had kept this land through decades of hard seasons and difficult markets, and the slow erasure of the ranching life that had surrounded him. Ethan had kept it through a different kind of difficulty, the kind that came not from drought or falling cattle prices, but from a set of documents filed in bad faith by a man who had decided that the rules applied to other people. Both kinds of difficulty in the end required the same response. You showed up. You paid attention. You did not let go of what was yours. Sometimes winning isn't about taking everything back. Sometimes it's about making sure the people who lied can never do it again, and then turning around and going back to work, because the land doesn't care about the drama. It only cares whether you show up, whether you know what you have, and whether you are willing to defend it with patience and evidence and the quiet, unshakable conviction that the truth, properly documented, will always outlast the lie built to replace it.